Every time a corruption scandal breaks, your brain does something predictable. It treats the corruption as an anomaly, a breakdown of an otherwise honest system, bad actors exploiting good institutions, the exception, not the rule. But what if that reaction is exactly backwards? Picture this. In 2019, 50 wealthy parents paid $25 million to get their kids into elite universities through straight-up fraud. Fake athletic profiles, Photoshop test scores, bribed officials. When the story broke, the public was shocked. How could these successful people risk everything for college admissions? Here's what Machiavelli would tell you. You're asking the wrong question. These weren't desperate criminals. They were respected lawyers, executives, doctors, and celebrities who genuinely believed they were being good parents. They had convinced themselves the system was already rigged, so they were just leveling the playing field. This is the psychology Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago. Corruption doesn't require evil people. It requires normal people operating within systems that reward corrupt behavior while punishing honest alternatives. Now, if you think those college admission parents were just uniquely entitled, let me show you something that might change your perspective entirely. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't your typical crypto bro chasing wealth. He was a committed, effective altruist, someone who believed in earning massive amounts of money specifically to give it away to maximize global welfare. His philosophy was about doing good in the most clear-sighted, ambitious, and unsentimental way possible. By 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He had stolen billions from FTX customers to cover trading losses at his hedge fund, Alameda Research. But here's the psychological twist that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. Effective altruist leaders had been warned about Bankman-Fried's unethical behavior as early as 2018. Yet, he continued to be celebrated as the movement's golden boy. Think about this for a moment. Here's someone who genuinely believed he was saving the world. In his mind, stealing customer funds wasn't theft. It was a necessary risk to generate the billions needed to prevent AI catastrophes and solve global poverty. Each fraudulent transaction was rationalized as serving the greater good. When risky trades went bad, he convinced himself that bigger bets were justified because the potential charitable impact was so enormous. This is what makes Machiavelli's insights so unsettling. He wrote in The Prince, "One can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit." Before you dismiss this as ancient cynicism, consider that he spent his career studying power across centuries of history. His conclusion wasn't born from pessimism. It emerged from recognizing patterns that most people refuse to see. The psychology here involves what researchers call moral licensing, when people's past good behavior makes them feel entitled to bend rules later. Bankman-Fried wasn't a calculating criminal at the start. He was an MIT graduate with a philosophy degree who genuinely wanted to maximize human welfare, which paradoxically made him feel justified in taking increasingly reckless risks with other people's money. This psychological mechanism operates everywhere power and resources intersect. People don't wake up deciding to be corrupt. They gradually rationalize increasingly questionable behavior until corruption becomes their normal operating procedure. This is why Machiavelli's insights remain relevant today. He understood that corruption isn't a moral failing that happens to bad people. It's the predictable outcome when normal people face institutional incentives that reward corrupt behavior while making honest alternatives costly or impossible. So the question becomes, if even people trying to save the world can end up stealing billions, what does that tell us about the rest of us? Maybe it's time someone you know heard this question too. Share this with someone who still thinks corruption is about moral character rather than system design. Because once you see how easily good intentions become theft, you can't unsee it. And that clarity is exactly what we need to build something better. Let's start with Machiavelli's most fundamental observation about human nature. He wrote, "The desire to acquire is a natural and ordinary thing." Notice he didn't say, "The desire to acquire is wrong," or "The desire to acquire corrupts people." He said it's natural and ordinary, as predictable as gravity. Modern behavioral economics has largely validated Machiavelli's observations. Self-interest theory shows that individuals often maximize their personal utility, even when they claim to be acting altruistically. This isn't a moral judgment. It's simply how humans tend to operate when incentives align with personal gain. But here's where it gets interesting. Self-interest doesn't just influence individual decisions. It frequently shapes entire systems. Consider how modern lobbying operates. Companies spend billions influencing legislation, not because they're inherently corrupt, but because it's profitable. A pharmaceutical company that invests $10 million in political contributions to block generic drug legislation might save hundreds of millions in profits. From their perspective, this isn't corruption, it's smart business. Think about your own workplace for a moment. Have you ever seen someone get promoted not because they were the most qualified, but because they had the right connections? Have you witnessed colleagues taking credit for others' work while those who actually did the work remained invisible? These aren't anomalies. They're predictable outcomes of systems that reward political maneuvering over actual performance. The uncomfortable truth is that self-interest doesn't just win occasionally, it wins consistently in systems that fail to account for it. Systems that ignore this reality don't eliminate corruption. They often simply hide it better. Let's look at a more recent example. In recent years, multiple major corporations, including Ericsson, were found guilty of massive bribery schemes, paying millions to officials worldwide to secure contracts. These weren't rogue employees acting alone. These were systematic corporate strategies implemented by otherwise successful, respected business leaders. They rationalized these payments as business development costs or consulting fees, but they were bribes, pure and simple. The pattern repeats throughout history because human psychology remains constant. Put anyone in a position where they can advance their interests through corruption, and most will choose that path. The few who refuse often find themselves outcompeted by those willing to bend rules. Machiavelli's most famous quote might be, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." But most people misunderstand what he meant. He wasn't advocating cruelty, he was explaining how deterrence works. In Machiavelli's Florence, he witnessed how the Medici family maintained power through a careful balance of fear and reward. They understood that human psychology responds to consequences. When people know that breaking rules will result in swift, certain punishment, they calculate differently. But when enforcement becomes weak or inconsistent, even well-intentioned people begin to rationalize rule-breaking. This connects directly to what psychologists call the certainty effect in behavioral economics. People aren't just motivated by the severity of potential punishment, they're far more influenced by the perceived probability of getting caught. When detection rates are low and punishment is uncertain, the risk-reward calculation shifts dramatically in favor of corrupt behavior. Rules only have power when breaking them carries real consequences. Remove the fear of punishment, and even well-intentioned people begin cutting corners. This is basic behavioral psychology. Deterrence theory shows that people calculate risk versus reward before acting. Look at pre-revolutionary France under Louis XVI. The French nobility lived in spectacular luxury while peasants starved, not because aristocrats were inherently evil, but because the crown no longer inspired fear. The king appeared weak, the enforcement mechanisms had crumbled, and the social contract had lost its teeth. When nobles realized they could extract wealth from their territories without facing royal consequences, corruption became systematic. They raised taxes arbitrarily, sold public offices for personal profit, and diverted state resources to fund their extravagant lifestyles. The absence of credible deterrence transformed isolated incidents of abuse into institutional corruption. This dynamic helps explain why corruption often flourishes in weak states and struggles in strong ones. It's not about the moral character of the people involved, it's about the probability of getting caught and punished. Effective deterrence requires 3 elements: swift detection, certain punishment, and meaningful consequences. Remove any of these, and corruption becomes not just possible, but likely. People aren't naturally honest, they're naturally calculating. When the math favors corruption, that's often what emerges. This is why authoritarian systems can have less petty corruption than democracies, though this comes at an enormous cost. Authoritarians don't eliminate corruption, they centralize it, creating massive extraction at the top while maintaining strict control below. The trade-off is the loss of freedom, accountability, and ultimately, far greater systematic abuse of power. Here's where Machiavelli's analysis becomes truly chilling. He observed, "A corrupt people can never be made free." This wasn't a moral condemnation. It was a diagnosis of how corruption spreads through social systems. For Machiavelli, this insight came from watching Italian city-states of his era. He saw how corruption in one institution, say the merchant guilds, would gradually infect the entire political system. Once merchants learned they could buy favorable trade policies, politicians learned they could sell their votes, judges learned they could auction their verdicts, and citizens learned that civic participation was meaningless because outcomes were predetermined by private deals. Modern criminology calls this the broken windows theory. When small violations are tolerated, larger ones follow inevitably. Corruption operates like a social contagion, spreading from person to person, institution to institution, until it becomes the dominant cultural norm. Imagine a city where traffic police always accept small bribes for minor violations. Initially, this might seem harmless. Who gets hurt by a $20 payment to avoid a parking ticket? But here's what happens next. The practice normalizes the idea that public officials can be bought. Citizens learn that rules are negotiable if you have cash. Police officers discover that their positions have monetary value beyond their salaries. Soon, bigger bribes start flowing for bigger violations. Building inspectors begin overlooking safety violations. Tax collectors start negotiating assessments. Judges begin considering donations when making rulings. What started as petty convenience becomes systematic institutional capture. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. Once people cross small ethical boundaries, crossing larger ones becomes easier. Each violation reduces psychological resistance to the next. Social norms shift as corruption becomes visible and unpunished. More dangerously, honest actors often find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. The building contractor who refuses to bribe inspectors loses contracts to competitors willing to pay. The business owner who won't contribute to political campaigns faces regulatory harassment. The civil servant who follows proper procedures gets passed over for promotion by colleagues who play the game. Gradually, the honest actors either adapt to the corrupt system or get pushed out entirely. This creates what economists call adverse selection, systems increasingly populated by actors willing to engage in corruption. Can you see how this creates a vicious cycle? The contagion effect explains why anti-corruption efforts often fail. You can't cure systematic corruption by prosecuting individual bad actors, because the system itself rewards and reproduces corrupt behavior. Clean up one area, and the corruption simply migrates to another. Breaking this cycle requires more than good intentions. It demands systematic changes to incentive structures, detection mechanisms, and social norms. But as Machiavelli noted, once corruption becomes culturally embedded, such changes become nearly impossible to implement. Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. But his deeper insight was recognizing that people don't just deceive others, they deceive themselves. In Renaissance Florence, Machiavelli watched wealthy merchants who simultaneously funded charitable works and exploited workers, church officials who preached poverty while accumulating vast personal wealth, and political leaders who spoke eloquently about civic virtue while conducting private deals that served only their family's interests. What fascinated him wasn't their hypocrisy, it was their genuine belief in their own righteousness. Consider how a local school board operates. Board members genuinely believe they're serving children's best interests when they award construction contracts to companies owned by their relatives. They've convinced themselves that family connections ensure quality work and community investment. When questioned, they'll passionately defend these decisions as examples of local partnership rather than nepotism. This isn't conscious hypocrisy, it's cognitive restructuring. The human mind is remarkably adept at reframing self-serving behavior as virtuous action. A CEO cuts employee salaries while increasing executive bonuses, then genuinely believes this tough leadership will save the company. A politician awards government contracts to campaign donors while sincerely arguing this rewards proven competence. Tech companies provide perfect examples of this psychological mechanism at scale. They spend millions on marketing campaigns about privacy protection and social responsibility, while building business models that extract and monetize personal data. Their executives give passionate speeches about democratizing information, while creating algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement regardless of social consequences. The sophisticated aspect is that many of these executives believe their own rhetoric. Cognitive dissonance theory shows people naturally align their self-perception with their actions to reduce psychological discomfort. It's psychologically easier to believe you're revolutionizing human communication than to acknowledge you're manipulating attention for profit. Machiavelli recognized this dual reality, public virtue, private interest, as fundamental to human nature rather than exceptional behavior. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous. Virtuous self-perception can enable more extensive corruption than cynical self-awareness would. The school board member who knows they're being corrupt might limit their violations out of guilt or fear. The board member who believes their nepotism serves children's interests faces no such psychological constraints. This explains why, as Machiavelli wrote, a prince never lacks legitimate reasons to break his promise. People don't typically violate their principles. They reconstruct their principles to justify their violations. The rationalization process transforms corruption into pragmatism, nepotism into loyalty, and extraction into leadership. Understanding this psychology is crucial for recognizing corruption patterns. The most dangerous corrupt actors aren't those who openly embrace vice. They're those who have convinced themselves their corrupt behavior serves higher purposes. Machiavelli's most profound insight might be his observation that all states are either corrupt or on the way to becoming so. This wasn't pessimism. It was recognition that corruption follows predictable patterns based on fundamental principles of entropy and human psychology. For Machiavelli, this cycle was visible everywhere in Renaissance Italy. He watched the rise and fall of the Florentine Republic, observed the internal dynamics of Venice's government, and studied the histories of Rome and other ancient powers. In each case, he saw the same pattern. Institutions begin with noble purposes and effective constraints, but success creates new opportunities for private gain, and human nature gradually overwhelms institutional safeguards. Systems naturally decay without constant maintenance and vigilance. Just as buildings crumble without upkeep and machines break down without service, institutions deteriorate without active efforts to maintain their integrity. But unlike physical systems, institutional maintenance requires fighting against human psychological tendencies rather than natural forces. The Roman Republic provides the classic example of this corruption cycle. Initially, Roman senators served brief terms, returned to private life afterward, and faced meaningful constraints on their behavior. Early Republican institutions channeled ambition toward public service through carefully designed incentives and punishments. But success created problems the founders hadn't anticipated. Military conquests brought enormous wealth into Rome, creating unprecedented opportunities for personal enrichment. Traditional constraints on behavior became harder to enforce as the empire expanded beyond the close-knit community where reputation mechanisms had previously operated. Gradually, senators discovered they could use public office to secure private advantages. They awarded themselves lucrative provincial governorships, manipulated public contracts for personal benefit, and used state resources to build private armies and political networks. What started as exceptional behavior became normal practice as each generation pushed boundaries further than the last. The crucial insight is that this wasn't a sudden collapse caused by uniquely corrupt individuals. It was a gradual erosion where each incremental violation made the next one easier to justify and implement. Traditional norms lost their force as behavior that would have shocked earlier generations became routine. Each step in the process was individually rational from the actors' perspectives. Why shouldn't a senator profit from his service when everyone else was doing the same? Why maintain costly principles when principled behavior put you at a competitive disadvantage? Why preserve institutions that constrained your success while rivals operated without such limits? The cumulative effect transformed the entire system. Public office evolved from service opportunity into extraction mechanism. Political competition shifted from policy debates to resource acquisition contests. Citizens lost faith in institutions as the gap between public rhetoric and private behavior became impossible to ignore. This corruption cycle explains why anti-corruption efforts often fail even when they achieve short-term success. Cleaning up isolated problems without addressing systemic incentives simply creates temporary improvements before underlying dynamics reassert themselves. The cycle also reveals why prevention is more effective than cure. Once corruption becomes systematically embedded in institutional culture, removing it requires rebuilding fundamental incentive structures, a task so difficult that it's rarely accomplished without external shock or internal revolution. So, where does this leave us? Machiavelli wasn't trying to depress us when he diagnosed corruption as humanity's default mode. He was providing a roadmap for building systems that actually work instead of systems that sound virtuous. Think about it this way. Machiavelli lived through the collapse of the Florentine Republic, witnessed the rise and fall of multiple Italian city-states, and studied the histories of successful and failed governments throughout the Mediterranean. His insights weren't theoretical. They were practical lessons learned from watching what actually worked versus what people hoped would work. Now, this isn't to say altruism doesn't exist, or that every individual is irredeemably self-interested. People regularly sacrifice for others, donate to charity, and choose principle over profit. Rather, Machiavelli would argue that, in aggregate, particularly when power and resources are at stake, the systemic incentives favoring self-interest are often so powerful that they overwhelm individual virtue unless specifically guarded against. The first step is acknowledging reality. Corruption isn't an exception that breaks otherwise honest systems. It's the predictable result of human psychology operating within institutional frameworks. People tend to act in their self-interest, rationalize behavior that serves their purposes, and adapt to whatever incentive structures they encounter. But here's the crucial insight. This doesn't mean we're doomed. It means we need to design systems that channel self-interest towards socially beneficial outcomes rather than hoping self-interest will disappear. What does designing systems that account for human nature actually look like in practice? Countervailing power. This requires ensuring that different self-interested groups check each other's behavior. Countervailing power isn't just theory, it's the principle behind independent inspectors general, who are designed to audit and investigate government agencies without political interference. Their career advancement depends on finding problems, not hiding them. Similarly, a truly independent judiciary creates incentives for judges to build reputations for fairness rather than favoritism, since their legitimacy depends on public trust in their impartiality. Rotating power structures. This demands preventing any group from capturing institutions permanently. Term limits exemplify this principle. They force regular turnover that makes long-term corruption networks harder to establish. In Singapore, senior civil servants are rotated between departments every few years, specifically to prevent the deep relationships that enable systematic corruption. Competitive elections and mandatory financial disclosure requirements serve the same function by making power temporary and visible. Independent enforcement. Machiavelli said power needs good arms, strong, independent enforcement. Brazil's Operation Car Wash proved it. Prosecutors jailed presidents, recovered billions, and won 90% public support. But soon the cheers turned to outrage. Judges were accused of bias, convictions overturned, and the crusade branded political. That's the paradox. People love independent watchdogs when they punish others, but hate them once they touch their own side. Even in the US, where the Office of Special Counsel works quietly on whistleblower cases, its survival depends on whether people side as neutral or as a weapon. Most importantly, it requires citizens who understand that eternal vigilance isn't just a patriotic slogan, it's a practical necessity. Systems that account for human nature must also account for the human tendency to become complacent about institutional maintenance. But here's Machiavelli's crucial warning for our time. Recognizing corruption requires seeing through the sophisticated narratives that hide it. Every corrupt system develops elegant explanations for why its corruption is actually virtue, why its self-dealing is actually service, and why its extraction is actually leadership. The choice isn't between corrupt societies and pure ones. That's a false binary that serves corrupt interests by making resistance seem hopeless. The choice is between societies that acknowledge and manage corruption versus those that deny and enable it. Here's the practical question Machiavelli would want you to ask about any institution: your workplace, your government, your community organizations. What would someone have to do to get caught and meaningfully punished for serving their own interests at the expense of the institution's stated purpose? If the answer is nothing realistic, or I don't know, you found your starting point. Because ultimately, that's what Machiavelli was after. Not the acceptance of corruption, but the creation of systems robust enough to channel human nature toward the common good, even when, especially when, individual actors are pursuing their own interests. Think someone in your circle needs this reality check? Whether it's a colleague navigating workplace politics, a friend frustrated with how things work, or a family member who still believes corruption is just about bad people. This isn't a conversation we can have alone. Share this with someone who's ready to see past the comfortable lies. Then ask them Machiavelli's crucial question: what would someone have to do to get caught and meaningfully punished in the systems you deal with daily? Their answer might surprise you both, and that conversation, that's where real change begins.